Good morning and welcome to worship at Bethany Lutheran Church in Red Lake Falls, Minnesota. My name is Pastor Gary Graff, and this is the third Sunday after Easter. Our reading for this morning is from the Gospel of St. Luke, the 24th chapter. Listen to these words that St. Luke shares with us. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only person in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is now the third day since all this took place. Some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but did not find the body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening." So he went to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when they broke the bread together. The Gospel of the Lord. Well, grace and peace from our God who loves. Maybe this has happened to you. You drive into a new community that you're not familiar with, and you drive down a road you've never driven down before. And all of a sudden on the street, cars come by, and they're honking their horns, and they're waving to you. And you think, my goodness, what a friendly community, all these people greeting us. But as you continue, more cars drive by, more honking, and more waving. And this time, the faces are not real friendly. And suddenly somebody pulls out right into your lane, driving towards you, honking and waving their hands. And all at once you realize you're on a one-way street and you're driving the wrong direction. And all these people, instead of greeting you, have been trying to tell you to turn around, turn around, turn around, go the other direction. Well, that reminds me of this morning's lesson in which we have Cleopas and John, two of Jesus' disciples, on the road to Emmaus, walking to this little village on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And we think to ourselves, you should turn around, Cleopas. You should turn around, John, because Jerusalem is where the resurrection of Jesus is happening. But you're going to Emmaus where nothing is happening. You're going the wrong direction. This is not where you should be going. And we have to wonder, why were they going to Emmaus when everything exciting was happening in Jerusalem? Jesus and the resurrection of the dead, Easter morning, the greatest day in the history of the human race. Wow. And they were missing out on it. Well, why were these disciples on the road to Emmaus? Well, maybe it had something to do with self-preservation. What's that they say? When going gets tough, get out of Dodge because you might be in trouble. And that's what was happening in Jerusalem. Jesus had just been crucified. He died a terrible, grisly death on a cross. And perhaps these disciples were thinking, well, if this is what happens to our master, how long will it be before it happens to us? How long will it be before we find ourselves crucified on a cross? Now we might think, oh, Cleopas and John, you men of little faith, couldn't you have stuck around for just another 24 hours? Maybe a week, and then witness the resurrection of Jesus from the dead? And it's awful easy for us to play armchair quarterback, to imagine ourselves in their footsteps, in their shoes. And what would we have done? Well, we would have stayed there. We would have been a little more brave. We would have been a little more faithful and trusting in the promise that Jesus made when he was still with us, to rise from the dead after 3 days. But we have to remember, what had Cleopas and John witnessed in Jerusalem? Well, death by crucifixion was something that the Romans reserved only for the worst of criminals. Normal murderers and axe murderers and things like that were crucified in a more humane manner. But Jesus was dying the worst possible death that they could sentence somebody to. Death on a cross. Crucifixion. Long, lingering, painful, and torturous. And again, they were thinking, if this happens to him, how long will it be before it happens to us? Let's get out of here while we still can. And oh yes, they had heard this report from the women. But, they were girls. What do you expect? The disciples had said it was an idle tale. And why be caught up in more of this foolishness than they already had been? Why take a chance when you can be safe in Emmaus? And so they were on the road to Emmaus. And disciples will be disciples. They're just ordinary human beings like the rest of us, made up of the same fleshy, fragile, flawed human nature that we all struggle with. And so while Jesus was being resurrected from the dead, they were running for their lives, scared, grieving, sad, hopes dashed to pieces on Good Friday. The disciples were just being disciples, but Jesus, at the same time, was still being Jesus, even after his death on the cross. In this morning's lesson, we see Jesus coming to the disciples and comforting them in their sorrow. I imagine Jesus was just as compassionate as he had been to many other people who had lost loved ones. He was known as a man who was willing to bear other people's burdens, and one who was acquainted with other people's griefs. And how did he approach John and Cleopas as they journeyed to Emmaus? Can I help you? You seem so sad. Tell me what you've been through, John. Tell me what it was like back in Jerusalem, Cleopas. Can you imagine Jesus, this man so full of heart and compassion, speaking to these disciples who were so devastated and distraught? And as they walked, they must have poured out their hearts to Jesus, poured out their hopes and dreams that were shattered to pieces, not knowing who he was, not being able to recognize him, because that's what happens when you're overwhelmed by grief, overwhelmed by sorrow, overcome by fear. But then as they approach Emmaus, Jesus breaks some bread with them, and they suddenly realize who they've been talking to. It has to be Jesus, because nobody else could love them this much. Nobody else could come to them in their sorrow with such comfort. And nobody else would accept them when they were wayward disciples, deserting their master, doubting his word. But Jesus comes not shaking his finger, but offering his hands of comfort and understanding. That's Jesus, isn't it? Same old Jesus they had known before Good Friday. And now he's resurrected from the dead. And immediately, Cleopas and John, it says, they turn around and they head back to Jerusalem, even as night is falling. And we can imagine those they must have met along the way, people who must have taunted and teased them, people they had passed, and now they see them going the other direction again. Why are you going back to Jerusalem, they must have said. What's wrong with you? Don't you know what's happened there? This Jesus, it was a good fellow. He talked about loving your neighbor and loving God. And look what happened to him. He's crucified. I tell you, if you got any kind of brains, you go back to Emmaus. Don't go to Jerusalem. You'll wind up on a cross. Look out for yourself. That's what you got to do in this wild and crazy world we live in. Maybe they heard stuff like that. Think of yourself. Do the thing that makes sense. Go to Emmaus where things are safe, not to Jerusalem. But these disciples are filled with a new power, a new hope, a new joy. They've seen Jesus resurrected from the dead, and nothing's going to stop them now. So on they march. And disciples have been marching to Jerusalem for 2,000 years now. not afraid of the consequences, not intimidated by the obstacles, but marching in the hope and faith of the resurrection, knowing that Jesus is with them. Well, it's a long line of disciples that have been marching to Jerusalem for 2,000 years now. Thousands, hundreds, millions of them. And every one of them are people just like you and me. Fragile, flawed human beings. Sometimes not knowing their left hand from their right. And yet who keeps them going? Who picks them up when they stumble? Who lifts them when they fall? It's as if there's this invisible comforter among them. This invisible helper. And who might that invisible helper be but Jesus, resurrected from the dead? And how do we know this Jesus? How do we experience this Jesus risen from the dead? Well, I wonder if we don't walk in the footsteps of John and Cleopas, enjoying that happy throng of disciples, not counting the obstacles, not fearing the difficulties, but marching with a new power, a new hope, and a new joy, choosing faith over fear, choosing hope over despair, choosing love over indifference and apathy, because they know the one who walks with them, Jesus, risen from the dead, to help all who follow in his name. So this morning, may we join John and Cleopas and Matthew, Mark and Luke and all the disciples who have ever been and ever will be as they march in the way of faith, in the way of the resurrection and power of Jesus risen from the dead. Amen.